and there are other incidents that go on. It's seemingly endless. So the JLM is particularly concerned about that. I think I've got about 30 seconds left. I will speak very briefly about my own Jewish community in the UK. I'm part of the Mizrahi Jewish community, and we've got a sister group in Budapest in Hungary. And Hungarian Jewish identity has sort of been repressed, often lost and forgotten in the wake of the Holocaust and under communism. And Maron Budapest have got a community centre, Aurora, and they managed to establish a safe space for people to explore their Judaism and Jewish culture. And I think that to give you a practical understanding of how Orban's cultivation of a culture of prejudice has really undermined Jews' ability to sort of organise in safe, liberal spaces, the centre was targeted for harassment by the authorities. They tried to close it, and lots of neo-Nazis also marched outside and threatened the centre. I can see I've gone quite a lot over the time now, actually, so I'm going to stop.
I think, yeah.
But thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the speakers.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Alina Bickman, Director for EU Affairs from B'nai B'rith, please.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and thank you to JLM and LME. It's really a pleasure to be part of the discussion and to share such a great panel with you guys. A little bit about B'nai B'rith. We are a global Jewish advocacy and service organization. We've been around for a very long time, basically since 1843, working with Jewish communities, but also with policymakers to make sure that basically at the end of the day, Jews can be openly and proudly Jewish. In Brussels, we're working with the European Union institutions on both policy and practice related to anti-Semitism, Holocaust remembrance. We also engage on the topic of Israel, and importantly, we try to highlight Jewish life as an integral part of the European fabric. I want to speak a little bit to what's being done actually on an EU level from a policy perspective. I think this could add to the discussion, but I think as a good backdrop, I wanted to also share a little bit of my own personal story. So I'm originally from Romania. I lived there until the age of 22, and I then moved to Budapest, where I did my master's. So I'm glad I'm speaking after Alex, because a lot of what you said actually very well resonates with my own experience. And for 4 years now, I've been in Brussels. So Glenn, we're speaking from the same location. And I think these three places are small microcosms of really what's going on across Europe. In Romania, I basically went to the only Jewish school in the whole country. For high school, I attended the public school, where I was the only Jew in a year of 1,000 students, roughly. And so my Jewishness was something that was very exotic, which at the time was a positive experience to some extent, but as time passed by, I started to be a bit more aware of the anti-Semitic undertone of this, exotic position. Because without knowing Jews, people, even in the middle of society, not just on the fringes, really tend to traffic in a lot of stereotypes on a really regular basis. Now, in Budapest, I imagined it would be a bit of a different story, because there is a really large Jewish community, one of the largest in Europe there. Yet, as Alex pointed out, this far-right political environment, the xenophobic rhetoric, the othering discourse that is really present in the public sphere makes it a very tense situation for the Jewish community. And on a structural level, of course, the community always has to, walk a fine line to make sure that it maintains good relations with government, on whose protection at the end of the day it relies. But the atmosphere there really has taken a toll on all minority groups and generally everyone embracing liberal values. I myself studied at the Central European University, which is one of the initiatives patroned by George Soros. And so the anti-Semitic campaign that was going on actually at the time when I was studying there was incredibly present. And then in Brussels, a place that I really, really love, I live in a neighborhood where every sidewalk is covered in graffiti of Israel is a colonial state, Israel is an apartheid state, a racist endeavor, and so on. There has been a recently appointed new government where there are sitting members with a track record of anti-Semitic remarks. Kosher slaughter and circumcision are also constantly under attack, and there's a lot of political pressure to act to ban religious practices. So I think these three experiences kind of illustrate a few different angles of how anti-Semitism may manifest itself across Europe, but perhaps more illustrative than all these is the fact that before coming to this event, we had a virtual commemoration of the 1-year anniversary of the terrorist attack on the synagogue in Halle in Germany, where a far-right terrorist aimed to massacre Jews on their holiest day. And this is a reality that Jews are living with every single day, and any Jew knows that they can be exposed to this at any time. But it's also important to keep in mind that there are developments, at least from a policy perspective, and I want to focus a little bit on that now. And the point I chose to start from is actually in 2013. It may seem a bit random. Certainly, there were other efforts before that. But in 2013, the Fundamental Rights Agency published its first ever report on the perceptions of Jewish Europeans with regards to anti-Semitism. So how do Jewish Europeans feel as Jews in Europe, basically? And the results of that survey were really stark. Some 70% of respondents considered anti-Semitism to be a problem. 80% thought that it's getting worse. And we see 5 years later, in 2018, actually these results are even worse. However, this report in 2013 led to the creation within the European Commission of a dedicated office for combating anti-Semitism. So this allowed the work to be kind of centralized, and it gave more recognition to the topic of anti-Semitism. In 2017, in the European Parliament, there was passed, but not easily, a resolution on anti-Semitism. It was actually tabled by the Social Democrats together with the European People's Party and ALDE, the Renew Europe currently. And an important part of this resolution was the Ihra definition. In 2018, the European Union Council adopted a unanimous declaration. So 28, at the time, still 28 member states unanimously agreed to a certain set of actions around security, education, victim support, but again,
most need to wind up.
Will do. Most importantly, the Ihra definition. And so I would like to stress the definition as really an important tool. But as a closing, I would say that at the end of the day, these policy measures, I think, we're optimistic, but also skeptical about their impact. And what will make a difference is having more solutions around mainstreaming Jewish life as part of European life. And so I look forward on engaging on that topic later in the discussion. Sorry to be a long.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much. Vinnie Goodman from the European Union of Jewish Students.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm going to try to keep my time, but I cannot promise it, knowing myself. My name is Vinnie Goodman. I'm originally from Vienna, Austria. I am now living in Brussels as well, where I'm the president of the European Union of Jewish Students. The European Union of Jewish Students, EUJS, is the umbrella organization of Jewish student unions in 36 European countries, and a democratic and peer-led representation of around 160,000 young Jews between 18 and 35. So when we say students, we also mean young people, just so that is clear. I wanted to actually start with giving you a little bit of an insight into the realities of my generation of Jews and how that felt like growing up in Europe. Because you can really say that my generation is the generation that grew up behind bulletproof glass. We know from an early childhood on that we are living under a constant threat. We are used to being asked questions by security guards before entering Jewish communal spaces. We used to joke that my Jewish school in Vienna, looked more like a prison than like a school. And in that school, we didn't only have fire drills, but also terror drills. At EUGS, we don't publish the location of our seminars and the location of our office. And actually, on my first trip of UGS, and I think that really demonstrates how we have been growing up in Europe, we were first in Brussels during Shavuot, the Jewish holiday, and went to synagogue here. And in Brussels, synagogues are guarded by armed soldiers with machine guns. Then 2 days later, we traveled to Washington, D.C., and went to a synagogue for Friday night. I mean, that was actually the first time in my life that in the diaspora outside of Israel, I've been to a synagogue that just had a door that was open, that had no security guard. And that felt stranger to me than standing in a synagogue in Brussels behind 10 soldiers with machine guns. And that very much represents the reality of how my generation has grown up, that we are just used to living with this constant threat and having constantly in our mind that something could happen. And actually, unfortunately, I think it is, and the last year really shows that it is necessary. Alina talked briefly about the FRA survey. Actually, 1.5 years ago, the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union and the European Commission, initiated by EUGS, released the first ever survey on perceptions of anti-Semitism among young European Jews. And some of the results were quite shocking, I have to say. For instance, almost half of the young European Jews you are going to meet have been themselves a victim of anti-Semitism in the last year. And since that study came out, it hasn't really gotten better. We have seen a huge rise of conspiracy ideologies and myths all over Europe, very often anti-Semitically connotated, having huge numbers of believers, bringing, for instance, 50,000 people to the streets in Berlin just last month. We have seen far-right terror. I'm actually just coming back from Halle, from Germany, where I took part in a commemoration in Halle for last year's terror attack in what could have been one of the biggest terror attacks on Jews since the Second World War. That was only avoided by luck in the end, that we didn't have 80 people dead, but only 2. And there have been 6 anti-Semitic attacks all over Europe last week. But I think there is something that can be done, and I'm going to try to focus a little bit on that and what some answers on that could be. Of course, short term, it means increasing security for Jewish communities, and it means listening to Jewish voices. But long term, I think part of the work that we at EUGS are doing goes into the right direction. In our work at EUGS, we advocate for Jewish rights and for human rights. That is the core of our ideology here at EUGS. It is our Jewish values, and we really try to stand in solidarity with other minorities. So that means that we are engaging in coalition building. We work a lot with the Roma community and with the Armenian community. And we have launched a campaign in December and January already to free the Uyghurs that are living in concentration camps in China right now. And we are also working in interfaith initiatives with the Muslim community. We work with the Muslim Jewish Conference, for instance. At the same time, we also try to tackle racism, discrimination in the Jewish community, both because we think it's the right thing to do, but also because we think that it's incredibly important for us to build these coalitions. Because if we build these genuine coalitions, then we can actually fight against anti-Semitism. But at the same time, and that is the thing that we are then asking from our coalition partners, we are also advocating for Jewish rights. And then I think that the main thing that we need to ensure when it comes to advocating for Jewish rights is that we have to normalize Jewish life in Europe. So what do I mean with this? This FRA survey, the same survey that I talked about before, also showed that 74% of young European Jews at least sometimes hide their identity as Jews. And that has various reasons. That has, of course, as I've already laid out, reasons that there is a really strong ascendant far right. I come from Austria, where we had the far right party with ties to organized neo-Nazi groups in our government. We can see all over Europe far right discourse taking center stage more and more, being adopted by centrist parties or by formerly centrist parties that are normalizing that discourse, that are working together with the far right. And we can see at the same time this far right openly trying to pander to Israel and to Jewish communities, but doing that in order to whitewash their racism, in order to kasher themselves, to make themselves seem okay. So that is a big part of the reason of why we feel unsafe. And I can say that especially after coming back from Germany, where we really saw this terrible attack last year. But it's not only the far right. It is, and I mean, I'm speaking here to a UK audience, so I mean, you are all aware of that, but there is also problems in parts of the far left and on the left. Because very often parts of the left don't care about Jewish rights when they are working in an intersectional approach. And they make people, they make Jews and young Jews especially choose between different identities, between the Jewish identity and the left-wing identity, the socialist identity, whatever. And that leads to movements like BDS that are shutting out Jews of progressive spaces. And that also has a real impact because almost 2/3 of young European Jews, I think, say that the Arab-Israeli conflict affects their safety in Europe. And Jews are very often the only minority that is not being heard, that is not allowed to define discrimination against us ourselves. And that is a big problem that we are seeing. But I think, and that is my last point that I'm going to make, and I hope that I haven't gone over my time yet, is that
you're on the edge of your time.
Very good. So I'm going to make my last point now, because I think that's the most important point, and we really need to change the narrative. When we talk about Jews and Jewish communities in Europe, we really do it in three realms, in three contexts. When we speak about Jews and with Jews, when we speak about anti-Semitism, when we speak about the Shoah, and sometimes when we speak about Israel and the Middle East conflict. And that is a problem, because all of these things are very important to us, but they are not defining us. They're not who we are. And all of them are negatively connotated. And that makes it very easy for people who don't often engage with Jews to dehumanize Jews. So I think what part of this answer needs to be is that we need to start talking about Jews in different contexts in the Jewish community. When we talk about culture, when we talk about art, when we talk about politics. And I think that is the key, that we have to build a society where Jewish narratives, but also narratives from refugees and migrants have a place, because that is a society that can be safe for Jews.
Okay, you pushed the envelope to its limit. Thank you very much, Vinny. Now, Hannah Rose, ex-president of the Union of Jewish Students.
Hi, thank you to LME and JLM for hosting this event. Really interesting, and I've been really interested in what all the panelists have had to say so far. I'll firstly apologise for my poor lighting. I'm only now realising that I need to buy a desk lamp, but I promise I will do that by the next event. I'm the former president of the Union of Jewish Students in the UK and Ireland, and I'm also a current trustee. I very much cannot claim to speak for UJS nowadays. It's a peer-led movement, so it's led by recent graduates, and I'm sure that's something that the Labour movement as a kind of peer-led grassroots movement can really get behind. So UJS is the umbrella organisation of Jewish societies on 70 campuses and the representative organisation of 8,500 Jewish students in the UK and Ireland. And most of what they do is looking after Jewish students on campus, making sure they have kosher food, making sure they can practice Judaism safely and to the level that they would like, and supporting Jewish students throughout their studies as students, as every other student as well. But of course, a piece of what they do is also to do with combating anti-Semitism on campus, which I'm sure you'll be unsurprised to hear has risen. And speaking to the CST statistics that Alex highlighted earlier, if you look at the reports over the years, anti-Semitism in the UK used to peak in times of conflict in Israel. So we'd see that direct correlation between a war in Gaza, let's say, and anti-Semitic attacks on British Jews who had nothing to do with Israel. That stopped in about 2016, and from every year since then, anti-Semitism has risen regardless of what's going on in Israel. So we very much know that it's on the rise, and students on campus feel that as well, whether that's to do with inappropriate comments that are made to them by their peers, graffiti that they see on the walls, motions in students' unions that are inappropriate and offensive. For the most part, it's not physical attacks, and that's something that Jewish students are very grateful to not be in that position, but it's also something that we work with the CST very closely so that we can avoid those situations. And we, like Vinny said, have to protect ourselves from those situations. But one of the ways in which UJS combats anti-Semitism on campus is by promoting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And they just launched a piece of research last week showing that despite multiple requests from the government and from Jewish students, out of 133 higher education institutions, only 29 have adopted the IHRA definition. And that's not just a symbolic measure, that's to do with the way in which anti-Semitism is tackled on campuses every day. So I'll give you an example. When I was doing my undergrad, there was a module that I wanted to take, and it transpired that the tutor had written an article saying that Jewish people were privileging the Holocaust, which is obviously an anti-Semitic remark. I wrote to the school because I wanted to do that module, and they told me it's not anti-Semitic, and they refused my request to use the IHRA definition. That meant that I didn't feel comfortable and wasn't able to take that module, and my academic studies were impinged because of that. Now, it's not, as I'm sure you'd agree, for a non-Jewish institution to tell a Jewish student what is and isn't anti-Semitic. And that is the real life impact of this situation on campus every day, is Jewish people being shut out, Jewish people being dictated to about what is and isn't their oppression. And sometimes it does impinge on their Jewish lives on campuses. But I'll also speak more broadly to kind of some of the political trends that we see across European campuses and across Europe nowadays. And differentiating between the extreme right, which is your neo-Nazi groups, your far-right terrorists, and the populist radical right, who are the far-right parties that are increasingly coming into government in Western Europe. And I'll speak briefly about why this has arisen, what does it look like, and then how we can tackle it. So this kind of wave of populism that we're experiencing across Western Europe is somewhat rooted in the kind of post-industrialism and anti-globalism that has arisen over the past couple of decades. You know, the switch to financial economies that have left people behind, and those identities of between the people and the state have been eroded, and people are looking for some new identity, somewhere to put their kind of, to understand their place in the world. And this is something which the trust in institutions, people didn't even realize that institutions were failing them until the lights had already gone red on the banks in 2008. And since then, we've really seen the impact of the financial crash on far-right populism across Europe, and there's really been a wave. And there is a theory that says that actually the rise of nationalism across the political agenda has actually meant that since the mainstream parties have taken a step back from the position, they've already radicalized publics, and that has brought in space for the far right and also the far left to take up and adopt those policy positions and win on their behalf. But also what we're seeing, and I think this is really important, especially to talk about as Jewish people, is the move from the far right, from outwardly scapegoating Jews to outwardly scapegoating Muslims. And that's something that I don't believe is a product of the refugee crisis, but has in itself created this refugee crisis. An idea that having refugees and bringing asylum seekers into the country is for some reason a security debate, which it shouldn't be. It should be a debate on international aid and helping people as internationalists, as left-wingers, as socialists. And that in itself is a testament to how deeply these populist and these far-right ideas have embedded themselves into British politics, into Western European politics. And that transpires not just in the election of governments, like Binny said, one of the coalition parties in Austria has been in the past few years the far-right party, the near success of Marine Le Pen in France, governments in, the rise of the AfD in Germany and across Western Europe, but in street movements, in the EDL, in defense leagues that march on mosques across Europe, on the identitarian movement that, hires boats to stop refugees coming into countries. And it's also the policies that we see implemented on a daily basis, and the way in which this country has opposed the giving asylum to people who deserve our help and need our help. And I'm sure this is something that Lord Dubs will speak to briefly. So it's important to remember that it's not a consequence of...
Hannah, can you move towards winding up?
Absolutely. It's not a consequence of far-right ideologies. It is in itself a far-right ideology. I'll wind up by talking about extremist content online briefly, because that is where it's manifesting nowadays, and the vast majority of anti-Semitism that we see in the UK is online. And that's not just on Twitter and Facebook and the mainstream media, it's also the way in which far-right groups, far-left groups, Islamist groups use alternative platforms, Gab, 4chan, 8chan, to organize and to isolate their hatred. And that is when we get this serious extremist issues, such as the way in which far-right terrorists have been radicalized. So I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but the online harms bill, which is upcoming, is severely needed in order to combat anti-Semitism, not just on the extreme right, but in the way in which we talk about racism within the mainstream and also on campus. Thanks.
Okay, Hannah, thank you very much. Alf Dubs.
Right, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this, and congratulations to the organisers of the conference. It's still pretty important. As part of my campaign on behalf of child refugees, I have had many invitations to speak at synagogues and Jewish schools. And indeed, the Jewish community has been incredibly supportive of a campaign for child refugees, given that many of the child refugees from Syria and Afghanistan and so on are Muslims. And that is a tribute to the Jewish community and the synagogues. The first time I went to the jungle in Calais, there were 12 of us, and there were 5 rabbis there on the visit. And you don't often get 5 rabbis together, at least I don't normally get that. So that's part of the positive side of it. On the other hand, going to speak to, over recent years, going to speak to Jewish schools, the first question that has come up, not been about refugees, it's been, why are you still in the Labour Party? Because of anti-Semitism. And I've had quite a few tweets and other messages. 2 or 3 times a message had said, it's a pity you survived the Holocaust. And there have been other hostile tweets like that as well. But having said that, I'm convinced that the majority of people in Britain, all faiths and none, are supportive of the idea of our taking child refugees, provided the argument is put to them and put to them fairly. But there's a minority, and the minority is very hostile. But what I have been reflecting on is that 75 years after the camps were liberated, we are still discussing anti-Semitism in this country or in Europe. And that is a real sign of failure. We'd have thought that that would all be over once we saw the horrors of the liberation of Belsen and Auschwitz and so on. Once we saw the horrors of that on our screens, that would never have happened again. And the other hurdle, I'll talk about the Labour Party a bit, is of course Equality and Human Rights Commission study report into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and that is going to come out, I believe, fairly soon. On the other hand, Keir Starmer, when he became leader, the first thing he did was to go and talk to the Jewish Board of Deputies and the Jewish community. And I think that was very positive. And I think that was understood by the Jewish community as an attempt by Keir Starmer to put the Labour Party on a new path. I found it incredibly painful, the arguments about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I found it personally painful, and I thought it was a terrible situation. And I hope that we'll soon be put that well behind us and it won't happen again. That's not to say we can forget about the issue, because there is anti-Semitism in all parties. The Labour Party has had the publicity, but it's happened in the Tory Party, and it's happened in other parties. But the Labour Party, unfortunately, got more of the adverse publicity about it. So the identification of the Labour Party with anti-Semitism was a real tragedy. Now, on the positive side again, the Holocaust Education Trust, with which I've been associated, does some fantastic work in ensuring that schools go to Auschwitz, that they have teams of ambassadors in schools who spread the word to those that haven't had a chance to see Auschwitz. And altogether, they use education as a way of making sure the next generation doesn't forget. And I think that is absolutely crucial in trying to tackle anti-Semitism. I was invited, not by the Holocaust Education Trust, by another organization about 1.5 years ago, to go and speak about refugees and the like to a maintained school in Bethnal Green. As it turned out, although maintained, it was pretty well, every student was a Muslim boy, and I talked to 3 of the year groups. And their project at the time, which is why they invited me to speak, was on Kindertransport and the Holocaust, which is pretty good for a mainly Muslim school. And then there came the Q&A, and one of the Muslim boys said to me, looked me in the eye and said, "What do I say to anybody who denies the Holocaust ever happened?" And I thought that was a terrific sign of a school and of these kids understanding the sort of issues that we've been talking about, understanding them in a way in which it's not normally regarded that Muslims actually are debating this. That's positive. I only went to that one Muslim school, lots of Jewish schools, but I still thought that was a positive experience, which has sort of made me feel, in a way, confident that things can be done if education is the way to do it. But if education doesn't do it, the anti-Semitism can creep in again among younger people. I think the issue politically that has bedeviled everything has been the attempt to, or the attempt not to, link the Middle East conflict between Israel and the Palestinians with anti-Semitism. I happen personally to think that the Israeli government is pretty awful these days. I don't like their policies. I said that once on a television program as an afterthought to something else, and I was then bitterly accused later on by saying that, how dare you? And I said, well, surely it's possible to criticize the policies of the Israeli government without being anti-Semitic. And he said, no, we see criticizing the Israeli government as a surrogate for anti-Semitism. To which I said, well, that's complete nonsense. We'll get nowhere in a sensible discussion if that is the attitude. Particularly as I remember about the Masorti community some time ago, and in fact the Israeli ambassador then said to me, of course you can criticize the Israeli government, they do it in the Knesset all the time. So, but the trouble with the Israeli-Palestine argument, as it's crept into anti-Semitism discussions here, and indeed obviously in Germany, as Benny said, is that it has distorted the ability to have a sensible discussion, because people still assume that if you're critical of Israel, you're being anti-Semitic. At least some people do, and then other people have to prove that they're pro-Palestinian, and therefore they make comments which seem to be anti-Semitic as well. And that has been a political problem in many European countries, and it's a problem. It's a problem that we have. Can I just, before I finish, say this? I've been shocked at the policies and the expressions by some of the Hungarian, Polish, and other politicians there. If we were still full members of the EU, if we were any members of the EU, we'd be better able to speak out about it and say it is a disgrace that an EU country's leaders advocate policies of anti-Semitism. I think that is absolutely shocking. Unfortunately, our influence with EU countries is now much less. But I'm deeply, deeply upset at the way Hungary and Poland and so on, they speak about these things. I'm also upset that the Hungarian policy said the refugees are not our concern, we're only interested in white Christians. That's a pretty anti-Semitic comment as well to make from the Hungarian government. So I think we have to stay on the alert. As somebody said at a meeting I went to some time ago, the Holocaust did not begin with the gas chambers. It started off with anti-Semitic words and language and hate speech. We're not going to get to the Holocaust, but I hope not anyway. But the danger is if we do not nip this in the bud, it gets worse and worse, it gets out of hand, and it becomes an accepted way of talking. So I particularly welcome the chance to have been invited to speak here, to listen to the other speakers. Glenn, I've known for years, and Hannah, we've worked together now, and I welcome this as an important initiative, and one which has to continue regardless of short-term events. It has to continue because we have to keep spreading the word, and anti-Semitism is a vile, vile poison in our society and in any society.
Thank you very much. Hell of a point to finish on. We've now got Q&A. The first question I've got actually follows on rather nicely from where we are. And it's from Louise Ellman, who asked the question, over the past years, we've experienced left-wing anti-Semitism in the Labour Party in the UK. Is there a similar problem with left-wing anti-Semitism across Europe? The two obvious people to deal with that question are either or both Benny Goodman. Benny, do you want to say something? And
yes,
then I'll come to Alina.
I mean, I think that you really have to differentiate to where you're looking at in Europe, because you can, Europe is just very, very different depending on where you look at. For instance, if you look when it comes to left-wing anti-Semitism on campus, you really cannot compare France to, let's say, Poland. So like in some countries, especially in Western Europe, you do see a movement like at Labour in the UK. For instance, in France, at the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the far left French candidate, has also had similar issues with anti-Semitism as Labour had, as Corbyn had. And you can also see that in countries like Spain and in countries in across Western Europe. And the same is true when it comes to students and anti-Semitism on campus. You can also see BDS really threatening Jewish students on campuses across Western Europe. But when you look at Central and Eastern Europe, the situation is a completely different one, where BDS, for instance, is really something that is unheard of. In most Eastern European countries, BDS, and I mean, Alina can talk to that better than I can do, but in most Eastern European countries, no one has ever heard about BDS, and it just doesn't exist. So I think it's really important to differentiate depending on where you're speaking from. But I do think that it has reached a different level in the UK than it has reached so far, thankfully, in most European countries.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Vinny, do you want to add anything?
I would maybe just add a thought on simply my interactions in the European Union institutions, and particularly in the European Parliament. I think there is a clear sense and a clear instinct to condemn anti-Semitism, but at the same time also clear reluctance to take it on as a topic head on, especially within anti-racist circles. There's almost a feeling of, we're always talking about anti-Semitism. Why are we having this discussion again? We need to talk about other forms of racism. And there isn't a sense that anti-Semitism is well integrated into this anti-racist discourse. And that's something I really think that we should be working on, particularly in this left-wing bubble. I think that's an important message to try to push through more.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions. I'm trying to finish this reasonably sharply at past, although I'll probably let it go on for five minutes or so afterwards, just so as people know what the plan is. So on that basis, I'm probably going to pose 2 or 3 questions at a time. They are related. We have a question from George Gilbert. Why does Viktor Orban hate George Soros? I have to say, as someone who had dinner with George Soros once, I don't know why he hates him either. I was rather impressed. Are there any European leaders you think are dealing with anti-Semitism effectively? And that's from Belle Anderson and from Alan Jones. To what extent do you think frozen living standards across the European Union, he said the UK, but it's a more general problem since the 2008 recession, have combined to promote the rise of anti-Semitism? I'll look at the people who weren't called on first time. Alf Dubs, have you got anything to say on any of those questions? Alf, you may need to unmute yourself. You need to unmute yourself. You're unmuted.
I've done it. Look, on the last of the 3 questions, I don't think so. I don't think the economic storm that hit us in 2008-9 is a reason or anyway justification or even a cause of anti-Semitism. I don't think it's like that. I think it's a much more deep-rooted thing in European history and has not been sufficiently wiped out in more recent years. But I don't take that analysis. There are other things about poverty certainly contribute to things in our society, but I don't think that was. Oh, and George Soros, I've never met him. I have nothing but admiration for George Soros. He does great work. And I think the fact that his university has been thrown out of Budapest is yet another lot of shame against the Hungarian government. Okay,
Hannah Rose, anything?
Yeah, what I will say is in regards to the final question, of course, it's not a reasonable excuse for anti-Semitism, but I think that a number of key global events, including not exclusive to the 2008 crash, also 9/11 and the war on terror subsequently, have produced in a lot of people a number of very legitimate grievances which haven't found an appropriate outlet. And I don't think anti-Semitism is necessarily the leader for that, but I think there is a group of ideologies, mostly conspiracy theories, that come together, and the logical outcome, if you're in that thinking, it's not logical, is often anti-Semitism. So, for example, someone who has deep mistrust of political institutions and mainstream politics, and someone who, you know, looks at the way in which the 9/11 and the aftermath happened, may well come to a number of conclusions that, you know, well, they build into typical anti-Semitic stereotypes. So they blame the banks, and they blame the media, and they blame the press, and they blame government, and then you get down this rabbit hole, and eventually you end up blaming Jews. I think that's where it comes from. I think what we need to be doing is dealing with legitimate grievances and stopping things spiraling to that point, and addressing them both rhetorically and politically in order to not only combat the far right, but make society better for everyone in general. Okay, thank you. I know that, Alex, you haven't been brought in yet, but you can start with this one. Do you think, this is from Eugenia Marna, do you think that Holocaust denial is best dealt with as a crime or by education? And secondly, in Germany, social media companies have 24 hours to remove hate speech. How do you think governments might adopt the same law across Europe? So, Alex, you can start.
Yeah, those are two really interesting questions. I'm sort of lost to, I'm not an expert on sort of the criminalization of the Holocaust and whether that's a good thing. I think it'd be difficult. I think Holocaust denial is probably going to happen. Whether there's not really too much you can do about it. I think that anti-Semitism has been around for a very long time. It's sometimes difficult for people to spot. It punches up, you know, it talks about perceived Jewish power, influence, control, whereas other forms of racism, which is also about power, you know, sometimes talk about perceived inferiority of different groups. And I think that lots of people will always struggle and might always come to Holocaust denial. I don't think criminalizing it will make too much difference, but obviously I think it's something that's bad, and yeah, maybe bad things should be illegal. It's a bit of a simplistic answer, but I'm sort of, yeah, I'd love to sort of say one more or the other. Maybe some others on the panel might know. In terms of the other question, just remind me, Glyn, sorry, what was
on hate speech? In Germany, social media companies have 24 hours to actually remove hate speech. Yeah, that should be adopted across the board.
Yeah, I think that we've seen enormous damage in the UK here in terms of how anti-Semitism is talked about online, and same goes for so many other groups where there's hate speech about them online, and the failure for companies to act and remove them, it causes such damage to individuals and begs the question, you know, these are private spaces. You wouldn't have a party where you let in all the neo-Nazis and Islamophobes and sexists and everything else. You know, you should be able to control. Free speech is really important, but those who breach free speech, there should be consequences. And I think that we have to remember these are private organizations who are able to target individuals based on their interest for advertising, and there are various algorithms to do that. Why can't they do that for hate speech? And I think that this is hate speech is a real consequence. I've you know, borne the brunt of it. So many of my friends and colleagues and comrades in the Jewish labor movement have, and the same goes for so many other communities online. I think it's really important that it's tackled.
Okay, Lena, do you have anything to add on that?
Perhaps I'll speak to the anti-Semitism online question. In fact, B'nai B'rith and UJS are part of a group of organizations that have now put forward a policy position on anti-Semitism online, because there is a big EU legislation on digital governance being cooked up, and this is really an opportunity to be more aggressive on the topic of hate speech. I think what happened in Germany, it's important to say that what they said is that illegal content has to be taken down. It's illegal content. So whatever is illegal offline should be considered illegal online as well. So we're not even speaking about hateful content that is only harmful but not illegal. This is strictly illegal content that's being removed. So I think it's only normal and the step that should really be replicated across the EU. Indeed, I think it's an important conversation and balance with freedom of speech when we go beyond this illegal question and we only speak of harmful content. As Alex pointed out, these are private platforms who could choose not to elevate hateful speech.
Okay, thank you. Vinny, any short comment to add, or shall we move on?
Yeah, no, I will add a very short comment, which I think is quite important though, because we really saw, especially during this pandemic, that the internet and social media especially are really engines of radicalization. Because Hannah talked before about Telegram, about 4chan, about 8chan, about these fringe message boards, but people don't start there. No one actually just wakes up one day in the morning and decides to go on 8chan and look up Nazi content. People start on YouTube and on Facebook, where the algorithm funnels them into a conspiracy rabbit hole, where the algorithm feeds them more and more extreme material. And that's how people get radicalized. And that is how the terrorist in Halle and the terrorist in Hanau and in Christchurch and in Pittsburgh got radicalized. So I really think that we need to act because we see such a dangerous development there, and it has real life consequences on the life and safety of Jews and other minorities.
Okay, right. We've got 3 more questions, I think. I'm going to give them to you all at one, and I'm going to ask each of you to make some comments, and probably very, very briefly, if you want, sum up, because we're beginning to come to the end of our event. So the 3 questions are, as we get from Timothy McFadden, as we get further away from the Holocaust, and there are less and less people still alive from the time to describe their horrific experiences, how do you make sure that the lessons learned aren't forgotten? So that's one. A second one was from Eleanor Jackson. She talks about she attends a German Protestant church whenever she can. And the experience there is a good dialogue program, but she's asking more generally, how can we improve dialogue and education of young people in terms of, if you want, the problems of anti-Semitism and I'm adding myself the Holocaust. And lastly, how do we deal with bullying? How do we deal with anti-Semitic bullying? That's a bit of a mixed bag. I'll go through them in reverse order from how you spoke. So, Elf Dubs.
Right. Well, if I can take the first one and the second one together, I partly dealt with it. I think it's very important that every student, every young person in our schools is educated and taught about the Holocaust and about anti-Semitism and about racism and Islamophobia. They're taught all those things, and it has to be done at school. And the more people that can be, young people that can be taken to our streets, shown what it is, that's an experience that they will never forget. And I think we've got to do that because you're quite right. There's a generation of people who are dying out. I mean, I was one of the youngest on the kinder transport, and most of the people I knew are no longer around. So I think it's absolutely important we keep that going, and I think education has to be a key part of it. I don't have much to say about bullying, other than the obvious things, except that I think, going back to the earlier question, I think we have to have proper laws about hate speech, and we have proper regulation of the social media, which also spread poison.
Okay, thank you. And then I'll go to Hannah Rose.
Yeah, I'll take the second question, if that's okay, and I'll speak specifically.
Yeah.
Sure.
Final comment, briefly.
About, students who I've had the pleasure of working with over the past few years. I actually think there's an impression that a lot of young people and a lot of students just want to kind of sit there, not do very much, not engage, don't really care about these issues. And from my experience, that's really not the case. Young people are very active, they care, and they want to build a better future. And when I was president of the Union of Jewish Students, we organised events on 40 campuses around Holocaust Memorial Day. We had around 6,000 students across the country, the vast majority of whom were non-Jewish, pack out the largest lecture theatre on campuses with no Jewish students at all. And people heard the message, people care, and people came of their own volition. And I think the more we treat young people as if they don't want to learn about racism, the less they're going to want to learn. I think there's a piece that all of us can do in empowering people to want to make those choices themselves. And I think that's the job of not only young people to make those stands, but organizations such as LME and JLM to give young people the tools and to give them the space in order to make those points. On that note, I would say and I'll wrap up with this, the biggest issue that I've had when discussing anti-Semitism over the years is people who don't want to listen. And it's complicated. It's a very difficult issue. There's all these dog whistles and this piece of anti-Semitism and this niche reference from 200 years ago. I don't expect everyone to know everything about anti-Semitism, but I do hope that everyone would want to learn and would want to understand when they were wrong. And I think it's that piece of empowerment and open-mindedness and education that is going to bring young people with us as we go into the future.
Okay, thank you. And now, Vinny Goodman.
Thanks a lot. I actually agree with everything that Hannah has said, 100%. And I was going to say a lot of the same things, actually, but Hannah was completely right. But 2 points I'm going to make is that, of course, like Shoah education, Holocaust education in the next few years will be a huge challenge. There is no question, because we need to completely rethink of how we do Shoah education. Because it is a fact, as has been mentioned before, that we unfortunately won't have survivors forever, and this will very much change our approach. And I don't think that there is a clear answer on how Shoah education is going to look like. But what I can say is that I also, like Hannah, had the pleasure of working with Jewish students from all over Europe on these issues, and seeing Shoah commemorations that both Jewish students and non-Jewish students have put on over the last few years, but also last year I went to Yad Vashem, to the International Holocaust Memorial in Israel, to an 8-day seminar where much of it was focused on new ways of remembrance and how we can continue to remember the Shoah. And the young people there, I was really impressed, the students, and I didn't have these ideas, but the students that we went there with had really a ton of amazing and new ideas of how to engage with the Shoah. And I actually think that this was maybe one silver lining of this pandemic, that it forced us this year around Yom HaShoah, which was at the height of the pandemic, at the height of the lockdown in most European countries, to already start to rethink on how we commemorate Yom HaShoah. And we, UGS, together with the World Union of Jewish Students and a bunch of other Jewish organizations and non-Jewish organizations, organized a very big and I would say quite successful online ceremony that went on for almost 24 hours, commemorating the Shoah this year on Yom HaShoah. Yeah, I talked a lot before, so I'm going to wrap up here.
Yeah. Alina.
Young people are great. That's
Alina.
Yeah, so now I have to agree with even more people that went before me. I think on the topic of Holocaust education, beyond everything that was said, and I'd be really curious to hear more about these initiatives, is just the idea of how do we go beyond speaking about the Holocaust as a historical event that happened in the past in a limited period of time and try to make it more of a learning point for today. And I think this may tie in a little bit with the question of bullying, because I think a big challenge that we face as we see that a lot of the policy tools put in place lead to limited results is around how do we build a civic responsibility around, standing up to bullying, not the person who is bullied, but everyone who witnesses it. So I think encouraging more civic education having to do with civil courage is really something to look at when we place anti-Semitism in a bit of a broader context.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, Alex, you've got 2 jobs to do. respond to the questions and maybe tell us a little bit about how we can join the Jewish labour movement.
Sure. I'll try not repeat all the great things that were said before me. I'll try not tackle the 3 questions quickly. In terms of lessons, how can we learn the lessons that have been, might be forgotten soon from the Holocaust? I'm sure they're not, because there's less people around to speak about it. I think sharing those personal stories and experiences are really powerful. In some ways, I'm personal testimony. Both my grandparents fled persecution, and the fact that I'm here today is, I guess, both testament to the really everything horrific that went on, but also the sort of generosity of spirit, and remembering that those common bonds and solidarity I talked about at the beginning, and that while humanity is awful, at the same time there are always good people who want to help out. So I think bringing those lessons, they're really powerful, and I think the Holocaust is perhaps one of the most powerful tools we can help educate people about all forms of hatred, because it was so awful, and the result, it was the mechanized industrial killing across Europe. And I think that it's a really horrible example of where hate leads, and I think that it's people who learn about the Holocaust perhaps are better inoculated against other forms of hatred, and that sort of comes on to bullying and Binny spoke earlier about the radicalization that happens online. I think that you need to consider that when people bully online, but also consider that actually, especially on the left, I think lots of times with anti-Semitism, people are really well-meaning. They don't want to be anti-Semitic. They don't hate Jewish people. They just unwittingly, as Hannah sort of touched upon, anti-Semitism is complex and people don't understand it. So perhaps going to people with that understanding and trying to help educate them might go some way. I think there's a lot of important role of education, really, about how we have civic discourse online, maybe helping people spot conspiracy theories. It's an increasing problem nowadays. We don't really learn at school how to use social media and how to look out for those signs to stop people going down the wrong path. So I think that's something that needs to be considered. As Glyn mentioned, I'm going to do a little advertisement now for the Jewish labour movement. We're a membership organisation. We have thousands of members strong, and looking around the virtual room, I don't see many who would qualify for our youth and student membership. We do have ally membership and full membership. You can find all about everything we do on our website, which is jewishlabour.uk, and myself and Rebecca, who's also on this call, I'm sure will be at hand to assist with any queries you have. We rely on your support, and there's so many things we want to do to campaign on. Links, I think, are going in the chat now, and if you've enjoyed this discussion and want to sort of hear more, but also get involved and tackle hate and other, all sorts of other things, do join us.
Okay, thank you. Can I say that the point has been made several times that the forgetting of the horrors of the Holocaust has started, and part of our job is to make sure that that's stopped, that doesn't happen. Can I thank the audience for, if you want, staying with us through the whole of the event? Can I thank the speakers? Generally at these kind of events, there's always a feeling that everything has been said, but not yet by everybody. I didn't get that impression this evening. We managed to knit together rather than overlap, and I thought that was very valuable. So thank you. I've now got the Advert for the Labour Movement for Europe, which is the pro-European section within, which is affiliated to the Labour Party nationally and regionally and locally. For those of you who are committed Europeans. We have another webinar coming up called How Will Brexit Affect Your Healthcare, jointly held with the Socialist Health Association. So at London branch on October the 22nd. So anyone who's interested in that can please sign up. Online, we're putting these details on the chat room so as you can actually access them. I know that some of you are already members. Some of you are subscribers to our newsletter. If I could encourage the subscribers or the people who've not met us before to actually join, it's only £5, so we would appreciate that. And if anyone wants to give more, we would gratefully receive it. Thank you very much. I look forward to continuing this dialogue over the coming months and years to make sure that the fight against anti-Semitism is not ended. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
I didn't realize it was really a kind of Brussels event. We could have all met socially distanced in the same room in Brussels, or at least the majority of us could.
You're welcome at the Flagey headquarters.
Okay, well, I live just on the edge of Molenbeek, so yeah.
Thank you. Is that an invitation?
If you want to come to Molenbeek, yes. Oh, please, I welcome you.
Definitely.
Molenbeek is very underrated.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Somebody is going to turn us off. It's probably going to be Harry. Yes, if you want to click the links, we're still up and running for that.